After Mrs. Darling gives her a cold response and asks her to visit some other day, narrator was disappointed and started moving back to station to catch the train. Having been rejected by Mrs. Darling, the narrator walks slowly back to the station. While walking down, she recalls the moments spent with her mother. The narrator was thinking about her past. She was now talking about the time when war was on, and it was during the first half of the war. The story goes into the flashback when the narrator's mother was alive. The memories of the narrator's bygone days come to light. Her mother had provided the address of Mrs. Darling years ago during the war. In the first half of the war, the narrator had visited her mother. Probably she was leaving out for studies. She noticed something about her house was very different. She had noticed that a few things were missing from the room as well as from the house. Her mother was surprised that she had noticed it quickly. When enquired, at that time her mother told her about Mrs. Darling. The narrator had never heard of that woman before. She happened to be an old acquaintance. What is an acquaintance? A person one knows slightly, but is not a close friend. So, she happened to be an old acquaintance of the narrator's mother. They had not seen each other for years. Lately, she had renewed contact with her and had been coming there regularly. The narrator's mother also informed the narrator that every time when Mrs. Darling came, she took something away. She took something home with her. Her mother also told her that Mrs. Darling took all the silver utensils from the dining table and the antique plates that were hanging on the wall. Each time Mrs. Darling went out with a full suitcase or bag carrying the large utensils and expensive items from her house. Being a kind-hearted woman, Mrs. S. means the narrator's mother, was even sympathetic for her when she carried all those heavy articles alone. Her mother told the narrator that Mrs. Darling was doing all this out of goodwill. The narrator's mother had not asked Mr. Darling to take things from their house. Mrs. Darling had made this suggestion to her mother by herself. She also told the narrator that Mrs. Darling herself said that she wanted to save all the things of Mrs. S. by keeping them with her, so that during the war, if they had to leave the country, their valuables would be safely kept with her. The narrator's mother thought that Mrs. Darling was doing them a favor. She was also obliged towards Mrs. Darling that she was carrying such heavy luggage out of their house every time she visited, as it was really risky of helping a Jew family during the war. But the narrator was not a gullible person. What is a gullible person? Who is easily persuaded to believe something. Mrs. S. was a gullible person, but narrator was not a gullible person. While the narrator's mother feels grateful to Mrs. Darling's help, whereas the narrator was suspicious of Mrs. Darling's intention, she became doubtful and apprehensive about the motives of Mrs. Darling. She asked straight away to her mother if she had agreed that Mrs. Darling should keep everything of their house. Question put by the narrator to her mother indicates the reader that the narrator did not like Mrs. Darling's sudden excessive interest in her mother's precious possessions. But the narrator considered Mrs. Darling, a very benevolent lady, who strived to save their nice things by carrying some of them away each time she visited. Mrs. S. trusted her completely, and to her Mrs. Darling was a very helpful lady. So she did not approve of her daughter's suspicious behavior. The narrator's mother was oblivious to Mrs. Darling's ulterior motive. The narrator's mother was a trusting woman. She was a lady of simplicity. She did not seem to have seen the harsh or cruel side of the two-faced world. She could easily befriend people and easily trust them. That is why she trusted Mrs. Darling, who was just an acquaintance of her. She allowed her to keep all the precious belongings until after the war. She had never thought that these things would be taken away by Mrs. Darling forever. She genuinely believed that Mrs. Darling would return everything after the war. Mrs. Darling, on the other hand, was a unique combination of cunningness and betrayal. She cheated Mrs. S. and seized her very precious belongings very wittingly. She was indeed a very shrewd lady. She actually used the opportunity to take advantage of Mrs. S.'s difficult circumstances. Mrs. Darling was aware of the ongoing politics and knew that probably no one from Mrs. S.'s family would survive to claim these things, and she can use them as her own. You can get the idea how these two ladies are opposite to each other in behavior and nature. Mrs. S. and Mrs. Darling represent the two visions through which war was viewed: the hopeful and helpless view which wanted the war, the nightmare, to end, and the other as passing inconvenience as it did not directly affect them. Mrs. Darling was a non-Jew whose life was not affected by the war as it affected the narrator and the family. Mrs. S. represents the essential goodness in every human, and Mrs. Darling represents the malicious version of it. War brings a dehumanizing effect on human beings. It kills the finer feelings of love and sympathy. It makes person cruel and selfish.